Welcome to Week 8, Part 2. We're continuing our discussion of the global revolution of the 20th and 21st centuries. First of all, we want to look at this map of Africa just to kind of review some of the places we're going to be speaking about today. There's the Sudan. Chad is right next door. And then we're going to be going down to the Democratic Republic of the Congo and talking about Rwanda. And then we're not going to be talking about Burundi, but some of your lessons do. And everything we talk about in terms of the Hutus and the Tutsis are all in this area of Rwanda, Burundi, and the Congo. When we last left off with Africa, we spoke about how in 1884 at the Congress of Berlin, European countries got together and just divided up the map of Africa, sometimes rather willy-nilly, with really no regard for boundaries between tribal units. And so these superimposed boundaries that came from the colonial past would prove to be troublesome in African history and even troublesome up to the present day. For example, in Rwanda, a civil war has been took place there between 1990 and 1994 between the Tutsi and the Hutu ethnic groups. Estimates of 1 million dead, 2 million refugees to other nations, and 1 million internal refugees. Most refugees have since returned to Rwanda. The Tutsi and Hutu divisions also plagued the Congo, and in fact the civil war from Rwanda spilled over into the Congo in 1996. Perhaps as many as 3 million dead in the Congo due to this civil war. The peace accord was signed in 2002, ratified by all parties in 2003, and a free multi-party elections were held in 2006. The Sudan has been very much in the news. The Islamic North versus the animist. Animist is, kind of a native religions that would practice animism, that is literally, worshiping things in nature. And also the South is Christian as well. Intermittent civil war has been there since 1955, since really the time of about independence. The first civil war lasted from 55 to 72, and a second civil war from 1983 to 2005 resulted in more than 2 million dead and more than 4 million refugees. Comprehensive peace agreement was signed in 2005, and since then the South Sudan has become independent. In the western Sudan, in the area of Darfur, the civil war began in 2003. The civilian population was attacked. Over 400,000 were killed. There were 2.8 million refugees. Thousands were raped. The terrible atrocities that took place there. 2008, the United Nations African Mission in Darfur assumed peacekeeping operations. The conflict there is still unresolved. Rebel groups have not signed a peace agreement, and a referendum about what is to happen to Darfur has not been held. Well, the Middle East, of course, has experienced its problems, especially since World War II. We'll be looking at that today. Just to kind of review a map of the Middle East, you see Turkey up here. This is Syria, Lebanon, Israel, you see Jerusalem, and here is Jordan. You see Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Oman, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and then up here Kuwait, Iraq, and this is the Tigris and Euphrates River, Iran, which used to be called Persia. And then over here, Egypt, and we're looking here at the Sinai Peninsula and the Suez Canal. When we last left off with the Middle East, we said that the Ottoman Empire had fallen apart at the end of World War I, and that France and Britain were given mandates by the League of Nations to take over certain possessions that had belonged to the Ottoman Empire and to prepare those areas for eventual self-government. So the French were given mandates in what is now Syria and Lebanon, the British in what is now Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Iraq, and Kuwait. We had also talked a little bit about Zionism being a movement composed principally, mainly of European and American Jews, which gained momentum during the fervor of 19th century nationalism and which sought a return of Jews to their homeland in Israel, that is in Palestine. The World Zionist Organization was officially established in 1897 in Basel, Switzerland. Its founder was Theodor Herzl, a Vietnamese playwright and journalist. Well, Britain felt that Palestine was ready for self-government and presented a plan which the United Nations worked on. The 1947 United Nations Partition Plan suggested that the area be partitioned, divided into two different states. In green, the Jewish state, and in the sand color, proposed Arab state. And then Jerusalem was to be administered as an international city. Now, at the time of the UN Partition Plan in 1947, the Jewish people accepted that plan. The Arab Palestinians rejected the partition plan. Israel went ahead and proclaimed its establishment as a Jewish state in 1948, and within hours of its independence, it was attacked by 7 Arab nations in what's called the First Arab-Israeli War. At that time, 700,000 Arabs fled Palestine. These refugees that fled during that time and formed the nucleus of the refugee problem in Israel and Palestine. Egypt at that time took the Gaza Strip, which is this area down here along the Sinai Peninsula where you see Gaza itself. Jordan went ahead and took the west bank of the Jordan River and East Jerusalem, and of course renamed the hill country of Judea and Samaria the West Bank. We'll be talking about the West Bank more later. So great areas were taken from Israel at that time during the First Arab-Israeli War. The Second Arab-Israeli War is sometimes called the Suez Crisis. At that time, Egypt took over from the private company that managed it, the Suez Canal. Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal and closed it to Israeli shipping. And in retaliation, Israel invaded the Sinai Peninsula, which you see here. And it also took over, of course, the Gaza Strip. And Israel agreed at the end of this war to withdraw from both the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula in return for, its ships being able to pass through the Straits of Iran. So basically, the Second Arab-Israeli War resulted in a stalemate, or rather, well, it was a stalemate and resulted really in the status quo of the way things largely were before the Second Arab-Israeli War. In 1964, the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, was created with the goal of establishing a Palestinian state. The PLO was a very anti-United States, which it regarded as being an imperialist power, and for years the PLO was headed up by Yasser Arafat, its leader. In 1967, the Third Arab-Israeli War, or what's sometimes called the Six-Day War because it lasted for 6 days from June 6th through 11th, was fought, and Israel regarded it as a preemptive strike against its Arab neighbors. And Israel was victorious in this war, and it took back the West Bank of the Jordan River, it took back eastern Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip, and it also took the Golan Heights and the Sinai Peninsula, and all of those things are noted here in the green, occupied by Israel in the Six-Day War, with the inset being, of course, that map that you just saw of the proposed partition plan. Now, of course, all of these areas become highly significant and important, especially the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and so forth in our discussions here in a few minutes. Well, a fourth Arab-Israeli war, sometimes called the Yom Kippur War, was fought between Israel on the one hand and Egypt and Syria on the other. Anwar Sadat's troops from Egypt attacked across the Suez Canal and on Yom Kippur, a holy day of the Jewish religion. The war lasted for 18 days. The Egyptian army really took a battering. A ceasefire was arranged, but peace negotiations stalled largely beyond forces in anyone's control, because it was just at this time that United States policy became paralyzed by the Watergate scandal and the collapse of Richard Nixon as president. Also in October, in an effort to convince the United States and other nations to use their influence to achieve Palestinian demands and to end their support of Israel, Saudi Arabia and other Arab nations of OPEC, which of course is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, began a production cutback, which was extended to a total oil embargo against two places, the United States and the Netherlands. Prices of gasoline skyrocketed in the U.S. from 30 cents a gallon to 70 cents per gallon, occasioning the nation's first oil crisis. The embargo was finally lifted in March of 1974. If we jump ahead to the presidency of Jimmy Carter, in 1978 at Camp David in Maryland, there occurred the Camp David Accords. There, Menachem Begin of Israel and Anwar Sadat concluded a peace whereby Israel returned the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. Now, both Anwar Sadat of Egypt and Menachem Begin of Israel were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize that year, and signed another official peace treaty between the two powers, Egypt and Israel, the following year in 1979. The PLO was involved in terrorist activities around the world. As an example of that, in October of 1983, PLO terrorists crashed a truck into the U.S. Marine headquarters in Beirut in Lebanon, killing 241 Americans. Iran and Syria were suspected at that time. In 1987, the Palestinians began an uprising against the Jews in Israel. This was to commemorate the Six-Day War of 1967, so it was 20 years after the Six-Day War. The Intifada literally means shaking off. This Palestinian uprising, of course, continues until this day. From the 1970s to 2005, there was a massive civil war in neighboring Lebanon. 100,000 were killed and 1 million displaced. Some 250,000 people left permanently. One of the factions involved in the civil war was Hezbollah, or Party of God, which is a Shiite Muslim faction that has consistently been supported by Iran and by the Ayatollah Khomeini, and that has expressed its desire to destroy Israel. Israeli troops were involved in the civil war, left Lebanon finally in 2000, and Syrian troops left in 2005. Now, a number of different accords occurred, peace settlements in Oslo, Norway, and together in the 1993 and 1995 peace agreements signed in Oslo are referred to collectively in the plural as the Oslo Accords. And some significant gains were made because the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which had never recognized Israel's right to exist, did just that, recognize the right to exist at Oslo. In turn, Israel recognized the PLO, and that kind of recognition is necessary for two parties to sit down and to begin to negotiate. Israel agreed to give some autonomy to the West Bank, to withdraw from Gaza and Jericho within 5 years, and the two agreed to continuing talks. Now, another thing that we need to look at is another movement called Hamas, which is an Arabic acronym meaning Islamic Resistance Movement. So, as the PLO began to negotiate and recognize Israel, Hamas became the new group which did not want the state of Israel to exist. Now, Israel did follow through with disengagement of Israeli defense forces from the Gaza Strip and from northern Samaria. And elections were held in the Palestinian areas and brought victory to Hamas, which continues to control the Gaza Strip. In 2012, in response to Palestinian rocket attacks, Israel staged an 8-day military crackdown in the Gaza. And, as you follow this, you continue to follow this conflict, again, the rocket attacks are usually going to be coming from places like the Gaza Strip, and there's usually then intermittent warfare. Well, now we turn to Iran, formerly called Persia. And for years and years, the Shah of Iran had a dictatorship there. The United States was friendly with the Shah of Iran, seeing, as Iran was an important producer of oil. In 1979, the Shah of Iran fell from power, and Iran cut off oil exports to the U.S., occasioning a second oil crisis in the United States. The Ayatollah Khomeini, a Shiite Muslim leader, assumed control of Iran at that time. And by October, the United States allowed the exiled Shah of Iran to enter the U.S. in order to undergo treatment for cancer. A few days later, on November 4th, a mob stormed the American embassy in Tehran in Iran and seized the diplomats and staff inside. The Ayatollah Khomeini endorsed the mob action and demanded the return of the Shah of Iran from the United States, along with all his wealth. And in exchange for the return of the Shah and his wealth, they said that they would release the 53 American hostages. The U.S. did not agree to all of this. The hostages were finally released after 444 days of captivity. Now, Iraq and Iran as neighbors have not always gotten along, and in 1980, war erupted between the two. Kuwait supported, interestingly enough, the Iraqi war effort. The war ended 8 years later and leaving 2 million dead. In 2005, Ahmadinejad was elected president. He has denied the Holocaust has ever occurred and has continuously called for the destruction of Israel. He claims that the uranium enrichment program is for peaceful, that is nuclear power purposes only. The UN Security Council has passed numerous resolutions calling for an end to Iran's uranium enrichment programs. Many of the people in the country have suffered because of economic boycotts, and with the internet and all things electronic these days are finding more out about the rest of the world and have really demanded that the regime change, and internal riots against the regime have occurred in 2009 and 2011, but in both instances they were quelled. Well, Afghanistan, now we turn there. Interestingly enough, in 1979, Afghanistan was invaded by the Soviet Union in support of a leftist coup there. The United States, meanwhile, supported the Afghan rebels with arms. So friends can, in fact, become enemies, as we'll see here in a moment. The Soviet Union soon became mired down in Afghanistan in a 10-year-long war and finally just gave up and withdrew its troops. By 1994, the Taliban, a very fundamentalist Islamic movement, began its uprising. in Afghanistan. By 1998, the Taliban controlled 2/3 of Afghanistan. In 1998, 2 American embassies in Africa, in Kenya and Tanzania, were later linked to the Al-Qaeda network, terrorist network of Osama bin Laden. Now, Osama bin Laden was born in Saudi Arabia, a fairly wealthy man, but he sequestered himself in Afghanistan because, of course, Afghanistan was, basically an anarchy, and there were places to hide out, and so on and so forth. In October of 2000, the USS Cole was attacked by a suicide bomb, killing 17 Americans. It too was linked to Osama bin Laden. So now, of course, we're leading up to some other activities of which you'll probably already know the outcome. But meanwhile, in 1990, in August, the forces of Saddam Hussein of Iraq invaded neighboring Kuwait. He wanted Kuwait, which the British had given independence to in 1921, as well as their oil fields, and the Gulf War began. The United States responded, as well as 36 other nations responded in a war against Iraq. On February 28th, U.S. President George Bush, this is the first George Bush, called for a ceasefire, which the Iraqi government accepted, and after 43 days, the war was over. Obviously, Iraq withdrew from Kuwait. Well, now all of these things are going to converge and intersect in 9/11 of 2001. 19 suicide attackers targeted 3 American symbols. 2 hijacked jetliners flew into the twin 110-story skyscrapers called the World Trade Center in New York, and as you know, within hours, both towers collapsed. A 3rd hijacked airliner struck the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia, and a 4th hijacked jet, presumably aiming for the White House, crashed near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, 80 miles from Pittsburgh. Heroic passengers of United Flight 93, hearing of prior attacks through telephone conversations with loved ones at home, overcame their assailants and sacrificed their lives in a successful attempt to thwart the hijackers' plans. In the 3 attacks, over 3,000 people died. So this was the first time that America had been attacked since, we talked about it, December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor, starting the U.S.'s entry into World War II. U.S. President George W. Bush decided that one needed to find out, what exactly was happening here. It was certainly a total shock to any of you who remember that or have heard about that, and pretty soon it was within claimed and by as the work of the Al-Qaeda network of Osama bin Laden. And it began a war which is still going on today, that is the War on Terror. As a response to all of this, in October of 2001, U.S. Special Forces, joined by Britain, began Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan to rout the Taliban. NATO joined the effort in 2003. In 2002, President Bush announced the Bush Doctrine, that in the future preemptive war might be necessary. And this is certainly a new kind of philosophy in foreign policy. Everyone, of course, was concerned about weapons of mass destruction. Did Iraq have weapons of mass destruction, etc.? The whole Operation Iraqi Freedom, or the Iraq War, began on March 19th of 2003. It it began to roll back the areas controlled by the regime, which fell very quickly, and Saddam Hussein, disappeared, and then was discovered, holed up, literally, and found guilty of war crimes against humanity and was hanged in 2006. The search for Osama bin Laden, of course, continued unabated, and he was killed in a compound in Pakistan by U.S. Special Forces in May of 2011, and his body was, the ashes from his body were subsequently thrown in the ocean. In December of 2011, the U.S. completed withdrawal of its forces from Iraq, and in 2012, NATO and the U.S. announced an exit strategy for troops in Afghanistan. Well, the last thing that we really need to look at is another amazing story in Middle Eastern history, and that is what has been dubbed the Arab Spring. And some people say that this takes its name from the Prague Spring, of the Cold War era, where some of the Eastern European countries were hoping to gain, democracy and so forth. Arab Spring, again, the idea of spring, a new opening, a new setting, a new start. A little background. Many of the Arab nations operate economically, at least what economists call in the form of rent. Now, rent means that, instead of taxing their people very much, that they really derive state income from, say, the sale of some major resource, in the case of the Middle East, oil. Or they might depend heavily, as Egypt did, on foreign aid. And the result was that they have had a tendency, as in the case of Saudi Arabia and other places, not to have to really tax their people. And of course, this is a two-edged sword. If on the one hand you tax people, as you do in the United States, then people want to demand accountability for how their taxes are used. So when the colonies, the 13 colonies, decided to wage a revolutionary war against Britain, the motto was no taxation without representation. Well, as one scholar in foreign affairs recently said in January-February 2013 edition, it's almost the opposite in the Middle East, where there's no representation without taxation. For example, King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia announced a $130 billion jobs wage benefits package in March 2011, trying to prevent any kind of riots or dissatisfaction, disgruntlement in his country. Freedom House estimates that 72% of the countries and 85% of the people of the Middle East and North Africa still lack basic political rights and civil liberties, and that's according to a Foreign Affairs article in January-February of 2013. The Arab Spring began in Tunisia in December 2010 when a street vendor set himself afire, and protest followed. By January, the president of the nation fled. In Egypt, protests began in February 2011, and the army refused to move against the protesters. And in fact, the army helped to remove President Mubarak, who had ruled with a iron fist for years over Egypt. Elections resulted there in the victory of Mohamed Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood to the presidency. Things are still kind of working their way out and hopefully settling down in Egypt, albeit it's a long road to the future. Libya. Protests broke out in Benghazi in February 2012, led to a civil war. NATO provided air support to the rebels, and the rebels end up killing the longtime leader, Muammar al-Gaddafi. Elections were held in July 2012, and in September 2012, the ambassador there, U.S. ambassador, and 3 other Americans were killed in a raid on the embassy in Benghazi, American embassy. In Yemen, a pink revolution, as it's called, occurred in January 2011. The civil war ensued after that. The president resigned. And following suit with all of this, protests against the dictatorship of the Assad family have led to a bloody and continuing civil war. I leave you with this quote by Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. One day we will learn that the heart can never be totally right if the head is totally wrong. Only through the bringing together of head and heart, intelligence and goodness, shall man rise to a fulfillment of his true nature. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure teaching you during these 8 weeks. If you have any questions, feel free to email or phone me. I'm always happy to help, and have a good day.